Let's now have a look at the logical operators. So on our operators page, let's click on the logical ones. And there we go. We've got a list of a few. First one is the AND. And the result is true if both A and B variables on both sides of this operator are evaluating to true. Then we have OR. True if either A or B is true. Then we have XOR, which is true if either A or B is true, but not both. Then we have NOT, which is this exclamation mark. True if A is not true. Then we have symbolic AND with two AND symbols basically. And it's true if both A and B are true. As you can see, it's exactly the same as the literal one. Then we have symbolic OR, and it basically evaluates to the same result as the literal one as well. So it's true if either A or B is true. And then we have the reason for the two different variations of AND and OR operators is that they operate at different precedences. If we click on this link, open it in a new tab, and you can read here that the precedence of an operator specifies how tightly it binds two expressions together. For example, in the expression 1 plus 5 multiplied by 3, the answer is 16 and not 18 because the multiplication character operator basically has a higher precedence than the addition operator. Parentheses may be used to force precedence if necessary. For example, 1 plus 5 in parentheses, then multiplied by 3 gives us 18. So let's now have a look at the example. If we go to our editor and in our index.php, let's use var_dump function. And in between the brackets, we are going to do our evaluation using simply Boolean true or false. So true and true. What is this going to give us? If I save it and preview everything in a browser, we need to open our project. I'm just going to go straight away here. It says php course.dev. And there we go. This specific expression gives us true. So if we go back to the editor, and now why does it give us true? Because obviously both return true, basically true and true must be true because there's not even mention of any false. So that's the first one. Now let's try and do the true and false. Now if we save it, preview everything in a browser, refresh, and this gives us false because both, for the expression to return true, both needs to be true, as you may remember. If at least one is false, then the expression will evaluate to false. That's why this specific one gives us false, because we have a one false here. Now let's try true and true, but with the symbolic operator, so and again true, and obviously you know what this is going to return, because as we've discussed already, they work logical and symbolic work exactly the same way. The only difference is basically in the order in which they are evaluated. So obviously we have true, and if I try the same with false, obviously we're going to get false. If we go back to the browser, there we go. So that's the AND operator, where for the expression to evaluate to true, operands on both sides of the AND operator have to return true. Otherwise, if at least one returns false, then the whole expression will return false. So let's now have a look at the OR operator. If we go back to our editor and let's change it true or using literal OR operator true as well. If we save it, preview it in a browser, and obviously we get true because both of them are true. If we go back to the editor and now let's do true or false. If it was the AND operator, this would return false because both of them have to be true with the AND operator in order for the expression to evaluate to true. But with the OR operator, if we now save it and preview in a browser, we still have true, because with the OR operator, at least one of the operands on either side of the operator has to evaluate to true. So now let's try the other way around. We're going to have false or true. And if we save this and preview it in a browser, refresh the page, we'll still have true because the second operand basically on the right hand side of the operator evaluated to true, because it basically checks, is this one or this one true? Yes, this one is true. So we return true in that case. And then if we check false and false, so it's false or false rather than and, obviously, then, well, we haven't got any of them evaluating to true. So in this case, we are going to have false. Now, if we try another example, I'm going to remove all this and we are going to create a few variables. A equals true, B equals true as well, and then we're going to have C, which equals to false. And let's try var dump again to see what our expression will return. And we are going to use A, double end symbol, which is the symbolic end operator, and then B variable, and then symbolic OR operator, which is basically these two bars, and C at the end. Now, the way this is going to be evaluated is basically first, this is going to be executed, basically because the symbolic AND operator has a higher priority over this symbolic OR operator. So basically, this specific expression will evaluate as if we were putting brackets around this first lot here. So if we just remove this, so what we're going to get basically, first of all, we're going to get A and B. Are they true? Yes, because true and true gives us true, and then or C, so all false basically. So in other words, if I just put the comment here, it would be true and true or false. And obviously because of the precedence of the operators themselves, that's how it will be evaluated. So basically what we should get, because this one returns true, and then we have OR operator false, and we know that with the OR operator, just one of them has to evaluate to true for the expression to evaluate to true. So if we save it and preview everything in the browser, we should get true, and fair enough, that's what we are getting. If we go back to the editor, let's try another example. This time, rather than having the symbolic one, we are going to use literal AND. And literal AND against symbolic OR works slightly different. This time, it will evaluate as if the expression was this way. Basically, if we were using brackets around the second part of this expression after the end. And this is because literal AND is of a lower precedence than the symbolic or symbolic AND as well. So now if we save it and preview it in a browser refresh, and we still get true, and this is because if we go back to the editor, you can see that obviously this A, if I just put brackets around this so you can actually see it clear, the A is true, and then we check in if this second expression is true as well. And it is true because it uses OR between these two variables. And the first one is true, and we know that with OR, obviously only one has to be true for the expression to return true. So we have true and true. We're obviously using Boolean values here, but you could also use any expression, which is what you're most likely going to be using in a real life scenario. So you could have, let's say, string, some string in between a single double quotes, and strings we know evaluate to true. So, or you could have the expression as well, say plus 1. That will obviously give us true, which is also true. And for false, we could have 1 minus 1, which gives us 0. And as we know, number 0 evaluates to false. So basically, we could have it this way. If we preview this in the browser, we have exactly the same result because they will evaluate to the same Boolean values as we were using originally. So I'm just going to go back with all this just so we can clearly see what we actually have in here. Obviously, as we can see, I cheated a little bit here because I shouldn't be using these brackets. I only use them to demonstrate how it's grouped. But if we save it, basically it will evaluate the same way. So we've got true basically. Let's now have a look at another example. I'm going to use, rather than AND here, I'm going to use the equal symbol. And after that one, I'm going to use a symbolic AND, so double AND symbol here. And now what's going to happen here is basically the single AND operator assigns the value of the operand on the right hand side of this operator. So basically what happens is A equals whatever we have on the right hand side. So we are assigning the value to this A variable, and because we are passing this A variable then to this var dump function, it will return whatever is associated with it. But with the symbolic AND operator, the symbolic AND operator has a higher precedence than the single equal operator, in which case what is going to happen, basically this is going to be grouped that way. So in other words, we're basically assigning whatever this specific expression evaluates to, this value will be basically associated with this A variable, and then we're going to return it with this var dump function. So let's quickly remove these brackets around this expression, save it and preview it in a browser, refresh the page, and it gives us false. And why does it give us false basically? Is because B and C, we're using this symbolic AND operator, obviously true and false returns false. So A, the value associated with A will be simply false, in which case we obviously got false with this var dump function. So now let's have a look at another example. Rather than using this symbolic AND operator, I'm going to use the literal one. And now literal one is of a lower precedence than the single equal symbol. So what's going to happen now is this expression will evaluate as if there were brackets around this A equals B. So what happens now, basically we're assigning true, which is associated with the B variable, to variable A, which is also true. So it doesn't really matter in this specific scenario, but let's replace this A with false. So basically this expression will overwrite whatever's associated with the A. So whatever's associated with the B, assign it to the A variable. So in other words, this A variable will now become true, return true. And then we are checking if the C variable is also true, basically. So we're checking with this AND literal AND operator. Obviously, this will also return false. I need to remove obviously these brackets to make sure that we can truly test it. If we preview everything in the browser, it gives us true false, obviously, because the operand on the right hand side of this AND operator is false, and obviously with AND both of them have to be true in order for the expression to evaluate to true. Let's now discuss the short circuit evaluation, which is the minimal evaluation. And what does it mean? PHP, as well as many other programming languages, follows the short circuit or minimal evaluation rule, which means that the second argument is executed or evaluated only if the first argument does not determine the value of the expression. In other words, if the first argument of the AND statement returns false, then the result must be false. Same applies to OR statement, which returns true, in which case the returned value must be true. As you know, with OR operator, if at least one of them is true, then the whole expression will evaluate to true. Same with the AND statement, with the AND operator. If the first one will be false, then we know that the whole expression will return false. In both cases, the second argument is never evaluated because the result is already determined by the first argument. And let's have a look at a few examples. I'm going to remove what we have here and simply use var dump again. And inside of this var dump function, I'm going to put the expression true, or, and I'm going to use the undefined variable, say string. We know this variable hasn't been defined anywhere before this variable actually is used, so that should throw an error, basically, because we haven't defined it. So if I save it and preview everything in a browser, refresh the page, and there we go, we get basically Boolean true. We don't see any error. And this is because, if we go back to the editor, because once this specific true has been returned using this OR operator, the second part, the expression on the right hand side of this operator, has never been executed. It's never been parsed by the PHP parser. Once we return true and then the PHP parser saw OR operator, okay, we already have true, we can ignore whatever's after that. So we're going further, and if there was any code after this var dump, this code would be executed. But this second argument here, this second expression on the right hand side of this operator would never be basically executed. So that's with the OR operator. Let's now change this first value to return false, and our operator, if we change it to the symbolic AND operator, if we save it, preview it in a browser, again, we are using the variable that hasn't been defined, and we get false rather than any error. If we go back to the editor, this is because for the AND operator, in order for the evaluation to return true, both of them have to return true. If we get false, then we know straight away we predefined the returned value of this expression, in which case we know this is false. AND operator is never going to return true if we've got at least one false, so the second one again is never executed. But if we change it to true and we save it, now preview it in a browser, this is where we get this undefined variable string, because both of the operands on both sides of this AND operator now have been basically evaluated. Because this one returned true, we need to check as well if the second one returns true, and obviously this is where we hit this undefined variable. That's why we got this error. Let's now have a look at this XOR operator, and what I'm going to do is basically remove this string and replace it as well with the operator XOR, and we are going to compare it against false. When I say compare, obviously I mean we are going to use this operator to check if the whole expression evaluates to true. And now what the XOR was doing, basically it said it will evaluate to true if either A, basically the operator on the left hand side, or B evaluates to true but not both. So basically if we have true and true, that should return false. So let's try first this one. So true and false should return true. So if we preview everything in a browser, refresh the page, and fair enough, we've got true. If we try the other way around, let's try false on the left hand side and true on the right hand side. If we save it, preview it in a browser, refresh the page, we'll still get true. But let's now try and do it with true and true. True and true, this should give us false. If we refresh the page, and there we go, that's false. And then the same for false and false. False, there we go, save it and preview it in the browser. Obviously none of them is true, so that should also return false. So that's basically the XOR. Let's also have a look at the non-logical operator, which is basically this exclamation mark. If we check isn't true true, so if we save it, preview it in a browser, refresh the page, and it gives us false, because what we're doing here, basically we are negating the value associated with this true, obviously value passed to this var dump. We are negating this, which is giving us false. If we negate false, then that should give us true. Basically it gives us the opposite of what we are, of the boolean value we are actually passing through. So if it was a string, let's say, with the exclamation mark at the beginning, let's say something, we know that string evaluates to true, but because we have this exclamation mark, that should give us false, and that's exactly what it does, basically. So that's the logical operators. Let's move to the next video.